Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, and this is the Eve Universe Show's continued coverage of the CSM 17 with the electorate interviews. Not the electorate, the candidate interviews. This time with Stitch Kaneland. How's it going, Stitch?
It's going great.
So, Stitch, you are with the Tuskers, which is a pretty well-renowned PvP organization. This is your, I believe, 4th year running. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, this will be the 4th.
Still at it. I mean, like, there's always been a very large supporting base for you. I know that for a fact. And of course, we talked again last year, which is kind of where I want to start with, which is that last year we talked, and I actually just was watching the video, so this kind of jumped out at me. During that, I posed a question to you based on the fact that, like, Torvald got a lot of things done 2 years ago, and whether or not you were hoping to, like, step in, given the fact that Torvald was not running. And you said yes, that you planned on, like, having the same sort of constituents that he would have. Now, I don't normally like to, like, invoke another specific candidate if possible, but, like, this kind of is pretty much on there. Torvald is running this year. How do you feel like you are an auxiliary to that? Do you feel like there's some sort of mistake in having him become a CSM elected person? Do you both to be part of it? What is your relationship with that, knowing that he is running?
So I don't have any, issues if he's running. I would hope, obviously, we could both be on the CSM if possible, because we both have faction warfare experience. We're both PvP minded, things like that. So I don't, I don't. It's not that I'm downtrodden that he's running against me. It's I think in either case it's a good outcome, whether it's Torvald or Phantomite or whoever the small gang low sec person is that wants to, get elected. I think it's kind of a win no matter what.
Is there any concern about splitting the vote though?
So there's obviously going to be the splitting of the vote. I mean, that's going to happen no matter what. There's always going to be overlap between candidates. While Torvald is more focused on faction warfare, specifically, I am more of a ecosystem ship balance candidate.
Okay.
So while I do want to provide input to faction warfare and non-faction warfare low sec, I also have a lot of input to provide for ship balance and ship or just general ecosystem changes.
Right.
Now, as far as, splitting the vote, again, it's always going to happen every year, unless if there's like a specific ballot that gets released for, independent or low sec candidates.
Which
but see, the thing there is
forming.
that, I'm sorry, what was that?
There is actually an independent voting block that is forming. Urschlag is putting together something, I think we call it Ibis now. So it's an independent voting block. So these things, we're hoping to have that influence. So that should help candidates like you.
Potentially. This, obviously, and this goes with the same thing like what happens with wormholes, is that you have wormhole candidates and then they'll butt heads with other candidates and they'll split the vote no matter how many times everyone says, just vote for one person so we can at least get someone on there. The same thing can potentially happen with independents, because the thing with independents is, like, especially with like Torvald or Suetonia or Phantomite, or even like the most recent one was Ibis or Lucy Lou, is that they have a lot of people that follow them for the things they do, like because they stream or they provide videos. Obviously, Suetonia had a lot of just previous experience with the CSM, so it kind of made sense,
right,
that he would get reelected.
Well, he was on the threshold of being hired by CCP for his knowledge.
right. And so then you kind of have that herd mentality of, well, this is a guy I like to watch stream all the time, so even though there might be an independent ballot, they're still going to be like, well, I want, Lucy Lou first, or I want Torvald first. So, again, there's always going to be some separation of the votes, even if there is an independent ballot, because, again, the same thing happens with, like, wormholes, because it's kind of the same philosophy.
Glorification of the fit, mortification of the unfit, talking stations. Thank you for that raid. 88 people. That is pretty awesome. We have just getting started. We've got a lot of interviews to go into, but we're going to keep on to this one. All right. So, as you said, 4th year. What do you feel that you have changed, or what do you feel has changed that will go from you being a strong candidate to an elected candidate this year?
So the two big things this year that are easy to kind of point out is I've had a direct influence in two changes that's been added to the game. So the first one was the Blops rebalance, which I think was early in the year. Actually, it's right after the CSM elections of last year, so CSM 16. So that might have been May or June that it got implemented.
Hold on. Yeah, I'll pull it up real quick.
Which was a direct, I talked to CCP Rise on it. We had a discussion on it. And pretty much they copy pasted my recommendations with a few small tweaks here and there, but the overall, implementation was the same. If you look at the bonuses on the Blops and how they rearranged the cloak speed bonus as a roll bonus, and then pretty much every Blops got a new trait added onto them. And then the second one was the Battleship Shield Extender and Armor Plate bonuses, the roll bonuses added onto those. So that was also a direct copy-paste that CCP implemented. And so from that alone, that kind of tells me or tells us that if CCP is already taking my ideas and I'm not on the CSM, then my ideas and implementations already align with theirs in terms of what they can technically achieve and what makes sense and are relatively balanced for the game. Not to say that I'm going to get on the CSM and just feed them ideas constantly, because that's not really what the CSM's for, but it's that I have an understanding of what they can implement already because I've already gotten things implemented into the game. And I mean, those are just two examples, but we
Clear
can go back years
of being able to work with the system in order to implement change.
Correct.
Right.
And I mean, this is just two things from this year, but I mean, we've talked in the past where, I mean, I've had changes implemented all the way back from 2015. So this isn't just like a one-off thing. This is something that generally happens relatively consistently.
Right. You have the Battlecruiser roll bonus rebalance from 2015, Battleship scan resolution buff in 2018, torpedo fitting and range buff in 19, mandatory ESS as a content driver. I'm sure a lot of people are super thrilled at you for that one. Blops rebalance in 2020, Battleship extender roll bonus, which was copy and pasted until I pointed out that, they called it, reinforced bulkheads, bolstered bulkheads, but didn't actually buff bulkheads. So, they added that buff in. Munin rebalance. Clearly the Munin is not a missile ship yet.
Yeah, those are well-received ideas that have not yet been implemented.
Right.
And also for the Battleship extended and roll bonus, the other thing is that while it was a copy-paste, CCP did the CCP thing, and they kind of went a little overboard in terms of what they added it to, because in my post it specifically called out it should not be added to Marauders and Blops. And CCP did that thing where they're like, well, let's just add it to Marauders and Blops. So now we have like 1 million EHP Paladins and fleet settings, so...
Yeah. Well, I think that CCP is relatively happy with the idea that Marauders are extraordinarily powerful. Like, they used to be considered very kind of niche, and so the idea that like they are unabashedly the top line sub-capital ship in the game, I think is kind of what they were going for. Likewise, Blops had their damage, I think it was, significantly increased to allow for their ability to like assassinate things.
Right.
So that you see a much better definition of those roles.
Right. I think the Blops is and I'm not just saying this because, I implemented the changes, but I think overall Blops are a lot more well-balanced now, and they can actually do their job more effectively. Plus, it opens up their roles a little bit better for things that are kind of outside of Blops. Like the Redeemer is a really good example of something that helps small gangs in certain situations. Now, granted, it doesn't happen as much now because capitals aren't around as much, but in the past, when we tackled a capital, you would have to gate like a Baelgorn, 3, 5, 8 jumps to start putting cap pressure on a capital. You don't need to do that anymore. You can just bring a bomber that's a lot faster, and then you can jump a Redeemer straight to, the capital to start putting new pressure on it. But right. Marauders, I got to ton of issues with, but I'm not going to get into it, unless if we have time.
No, I mean,
so we can.
Sure. Let's talk about it.
So Marauders, in my opinion, the issue I have with them is that, for one, they're T2. And historically, and I know this doesn't apply to everything, but historically, T2 is specialization. So I don't like something that is just a flat, this is better than everything when it's a T2 ship. And then, and there's been comments made in the past.
Is hack just a better combat cruiser? Like, what do you think is the specialization of a hack?
And see, that's kind of why I made that exception, or that mention, is that I don't think hacks are properly represented as T2 either, because CCP has done so many changes and add-ons to hacks that they're just this conglomeration of everything that synergizes all the bad things in the meta. Because you have a sniper cruiser that has more targeting range in some cases than battleships. It has medium weapons, which track inherently better than large weapons. They're shooting at similar ranges as battleships. They have good speed. They have T2 resistances. They have the ADCU. So generally in the past, and by past I mean like pre-2015, sniper ships, their sacrifices, they had low tank.
Right.
And with the current way that hacks are set up, is that you get all this range out of them that's just by default. You don't have to make any fitting sacrifices for it. And then on top of that, you get all the tank, you get the ADCU, which essentially makes you invulnerable for 15 seconds, which allows you to, resist alpha strikes. Again, hacks are just kind of a mess right now. And, again, that's a separate topic I could talk about a bunch as well.
I think that a good example would be command destroyers, right? Command destroyers pick up a bunch of cool abilities, right? The micro jump drive micro jump field generator, the boosts, the ability to use defender missiles, so much more capable of being like a support ship for a fleet. However, while they are tankier than a destroyer, they are objectively lower like damage capabilities than a normal destroyer. Like, if you just want to like get out there and kill something, a Thrasher will do better, or like a Algos will do better than a Magus, for example.
Right. Or even like heavy interdiction cruisers, they're very focused on just, the hit point and the bubble. They have some damage bonuses, but they're not necessarily better than even like a T1 cruiser in terms of raw damage potential. A lot of them are missing drones, except for the Devoter. There's a lot of examples for T2 where they specialize and it makes sense. Assault frigates kind of fall in that range where they're kind of good at certain things. But see, the thing with assault frigates is you can counter them pretty easily. With like even T1 destroyers, if you know how to counter them. Same thing with hacks. Now, this doesn't apply in a fleet-wide setting, but like in 1v1s or small gang, you can counter a hack pretty easily with T1 ships. Like, I've killed a Proteus with a Bellicose, and I've killed almost, I almost killed a Demos with a Bellicose as well. It's just more people came in and I died. So it's not that you can't kill hacks with other ships, because they're better. It's just, you need the proper counters. Whereas with like going back to Marauders, there's nothing you can do against a Marauder with a lower tier ship like T1 Navy faction, because they tank more more DPS than you can put out, and they do more DPS than you, so you can't tank them. So there's that missing correlation between punching up or making counterfeits that doesn't apply to Marauders, because they're just better at everything with no real weakness.
Well, you can nude them out and you can jam them.
You can't nude them out if they're XLASB fit. So like the Vargur and Golem can just perma-tank under all the nudes, especially if they have Gnosis.
I mean, you can nude them out, it just doesn't do any good in that case.
Yeah, and I mean, if they have Gnosis running, then they can just run their scrams and points and whatever.
That's fair. Okay, but so the problem here, the thing that all three of those have in common is that, like, a recon has a specialization of E-War. A command destroyer has a specialization of fleet support. Assault frigate, assault cruiser, and a marauder all have the specialization of combat, which kind of sets it up like it's hard to make that into a specialization. So it's
Right, it's
one thing to
very
criticize it, it's
broad.
another thing to suggest something. What do you think would be the way to make those ships feel specialized without necessarily making them feel like they can't be used in what they should be used for?
So hacks is, and I'm going to try to keep this short. I'm going to just offer a general uh, role. We can get into it more if you want to, but the general role that hacks should be playing is they should be skirmish ships. So their range need to be significantly reduced. They need to be balanced around the ADCU as a way to go in, kill something, activate ADCU, get out, reposition, kind of rinse, repeat. Or they can be balanced around um, like afterburner brawling type ships, where that ADCU synergizes a lot more with being a heavy tackle or a heavy cruiser, something that gets into the thick of things that can mitigate some damage and tank a lot. And that makes a lot more sense with the ADCU because again, you're essentially being invulnerable. And in the past, again, pre 2015, pre 2014, we saw afterburner hack doctrines like the old AB zealots and things like that.
Right, but then they nerfed that bonus. Right?
Right.
No,
Well,
wait, no, that was the
then,
micro warp drive bonus.
yeah, then they took
Never
the
mind.
micro warp drive bonus out, which hurt small gang a lot and didn't really have any effect on fleets. But anyway.
Yeah, sorry, my bad.
The assault frigates, again, assault frigates are relatively well balanced because, again, destroyers and things counter them really well if you know what you're doing. There are some that stand out that are issues, like the Jaguar. It's just a ramjag and nullsec where they don't fit any guns on it. They just max tank it and ram you with it. And that's where the ADCU kind of has an issue on frigates because it's just a very point and click type thing that doesn't really require a whole lot of skill. And it's a common thing, even I mention it in my CSM posts, is that I don't like press button receive bacon modules where there is no input other than pressing one button. You get all the bonuses and you can ignore it, which is why ramjag alts are so easy to use compared to like an interceptor alt.
But isn't it more of an issue of when to use it, not how to use it?
I mean, in a fleet setting maybe, but not really with a Jaguar. You can use it as on the approach in, so you're not taking a bunch of damage. You get tackle, you put on your nonces, and then you just continue tackle and tanking through the medium ancillary shield boosters. Because you can't even nude them out because they have nonces.
Right. So one of the suggestions that I made back when the assault ships were being rebalanced the first time is I never liked the ADCU from the very beginning. I don't like the idea that everything's just about damage. So it's just another way to change how much damage is coming in. I always thought that, especially with the fact that they had just reintroduced the idea of E-War resistances, that the ADCU should actually help the ship slough E-War, not damage. So that way you actually feel like you can assault. You can get in there, slough the webs, slough the newts, slough the, the other stuff and get the job done, which would make assault ships counter E-War ships counter, fast ships, like the interceptors. But they went with this damage mechanic. Do you feel like it might be worth revisiting and changing the nature of the ADCU entirely?
I would love it if CCP would iterate on the ADCU. They've done a couple tweaks here and there in the past, but I don't think it really touches on the issues with it. I don't necessarily like EWAR resistance in the game because that kind of follows in the same issue of it can be easily abused because, again, looking at Marauders, they have kind of the same thing. But the main idea I have for the ADCU to take it more as a module you need to fit for and adjust for is that I think the ADCU needs to have a consistent cap draw, not just a single-use cap draw, but during the entire cycle of the ADCU, every 3 seconds or whatever the case may be, you see a significant cap draw. So if you want to get that full 15 seconds out of it, maybe you need to have a cap booster. If someone is nuding you and you're running the ADCU and you happen to be at 0 cap when your ADCU does that next 3-second tick, then your ADCU turns off. So that at least provides some counter pressure to the ADCU. And also it makes people think, well, should I use an ADCU if it's going to turn off my micro warp drive, maybe in like a fleet setting, because it's pulling so much cap, or should I just fit a standard DCU instead? So again, now you have fitting choices. Should I fit more around maintaining my cap for the ADCU and all the benefits it provides, or should I be, just fitting a standard DCU so I'm not having to worry about the cap pressure?
It is also worth noting that a standard DCU actually does provide more base resistances than an ADCU. It just can't obviously do the assault.
Right. It's I mean, it's very minor, but yeah.
Yeah.
There's
But okay, so but my issue is like going all the way back, like the name of the ship is Assault, right? It doesn't feel like assault ships are encouraged to assault things, right? Munins, which are one of the most well-known, I wouldn't call that. You said skirmishing, right? Like, or
right.
kiting. Like, these are not assault-like tactics. You would think that the bonuses for the ship would push it towards wanting to get in there and up close and personal and get some work done. That's why I actually thought it should be E-War resistances, so that way you feel comfortable being up close and personal.
Right. Now by skirmishing I don't mean kiting. Skirmishing I use as a term of getting into the fray of things, finding a specific target, doing what you need to do to that target, whatever the case may be, and then kind of pulling range and repositioning. Or in the case of like an afterburner doctrine, get in the thick of things, and then you are doing heavy assaulting because you're right in the middle of things. And again, this is a big topic because I really think hacks need to be reworked from the ground up. I really think maybe they could see like a roll bonus with afterburners, because not only would that change like the fleet meta a little bit, but it would also change the ESS meta, because the ESS meta right now is heavily dominated by Sancha ships because they're the only ship that have an afterburner bonus. So if you kind of mix that up and all hacks get afterburner bonuses, and that also affects how the meta plays out in the ESS. So you're kind of killing two birds, or maybe three birds with one stone with those potential changes. Now, in my defense, or as a disclaimer, not saying that needs to happen. It's just, I think it's an interesting way to mix things up.
Yeah, we're just exploring how we think about issues, right? Like, we're not going to like solve the problem right here. We're trying to see how you work through issues as a candidate, because you're going to be the one, or you're hoping to be the one that's sitting at the table when these discussions are happening for real, right?
Right.
I just had the thought, like, in a lot of other MMOs, there is an ability. There's what's called a gap closer, right? An ability that specifically allows you to charge a target. We have micro jump drives, which allow you to kind of randomly move. I wonder if it'd be interesting for there to be, like, instead of having a super tanky ability, have it literally be that assault ships can blink on top of their opponent target to make them more like difficult to slough off themselves.
Well, you have the combat interceptor bonus, which is an overheat bonus to micro warp drives and afterburners. So, I mean, you could facilitate something like that on hacks.
Well, I meant like something that you like hit it and you literally like blink to a person as long as they're within range.
I think that'd be abused too much, because I mean, Probably. we already deal with that in small gang responses with micro jump drive battleships, where they just throw like 10 micro jump drive ships at you and you're just dodging micro jump drives all the time. So if you had a frigate or a hack that is able to just, jump 20, 50 kilometers immediately on top of you, then that eliminates, pretty much an entire playstyle. Now, I'm not a defender of kiting. Anyone who's seen my videos knows that I am dominantly a brawler. Pretty much everything I do is brawling. But with that being said, all playstyles should be represented, and I don't think things need to be added to the game that completely destroy a playstyle.
People are saying, please no blink. I'm not suggesting it's a great idea. I was just brainstorming like how other ways that we could look at the idea of like an assault ship and give it the flavor that it needs without necessarily leaving it as one functionality, right? If you give its primary ability the ability to be on top of your opponent, then that does specialize what kind of things the hacks can and cannot do. In the same way that command destroyers kind of affect what kind of things that it can and cannot do. All right, so, right. But hacks aside, so then let's look at Marauders, right? Marauders are supposed to be this, like, all-in-one weapons platform, long-range combat, like, in other words, like, doesn't require much resupply. That's why it uses half the weapons, low amounts of ammo, huge cargo bays. It's always kind of been designed to be that way. Obviously, the buff that came to it was significant, and no one will say otherwise. you think that they are too strong right now. Why don't we talk a little bit about that and what you would recommend to fix it?
So the main premise behind the Marauder changes, and I do agree that Marauders needed a buff. Because in the past, especially from a PvE standpoint, like why would you ever pick a Marauder when a Rattlesnake can pretty much do everything a Marauder could back then? It did more, and it did it better and cheaper. So I definitely agree that Marauders needed a change. And when you look at when the announcement was made, when CCP was saying we're going to buff Marauders, CCP Rise went on Reddit during one of the threads about the Marauder changes, and he said that we're primarily focusing on rebalancing these around PvE.
Right.
Now, if there's some additional bonuses that happen in PvP, then that just is going to
Yes,
happen.
it is being rebalanced with the consideration of PvE. If it gets adopted in because the question, like people were like, well, because the Bastion doesn't allow remote reps, so people are like, the question was whether or not it would be applied into PvP. And Rise said we're not really worried. Like if it does, then great. But that isn't what we're balancing this for. That's correct.
Right. And again, going back to what I said before about T2 being specialization, if Marauders are supposed to be focused primarily on PvE, then in a way that is a specialization. Now, obviously, that's very broad, just like we talk about combat being a broad specialization. But in my mind, if you're going to specialize something in PvE, then it should have some inherent weaknesses in PvP in PvP. And I think this is kind of an idea I've been working with here for a couple months. I've been thinking on it. Again, not saying this is the solution. It's just one that I find that does allow it to be specialized, but not influence too much on PvE to some degree. And that is either splitting Bastion into two Bastion modules. Because again, Marauders have multiple utility highs. So you can have your DPS Bastion, then you can have your tank Bastion. Now that's not quite as black and white as it sounds, where you only have DPS and then you only have tank. The primary split would be that like the tank Bastion gives you the current tank bonuses and then 25% of the DPS bonus from Bastion. So you don't get the full DPS bonus at the same time. The DPS Bastion, again, same thing. You get the full DPS of the current Bastion and then only 25% of the tank bonus from the current Bastion. So now there is a focus on, do you need more tank or do you need more DPS? And from there, that then opens up vulnerabilities to a Marauder. So if it goes DPS, then it can't tank as much. So then you can just hit it with a really high DPS battleship. You can crack it during that 30-second window, and then it'll go down. Or if they need to tank a lot, then they're not doing 3,000 or 4,000 DPS. So there's some give and take there. Now, the other alternative, instead of having two separate Bastion modules, is to script it. But I have heard in the past that CCP Rise hates scripted modules because I think from a technical standpoint, they're kind of a pain in the ass to put in. Right. But if they're scripted, then that doesn't give you the fitting choice penalty that I kind of want. So on the flip side, if they're scripted, then I think Bastion should last at least a minute. So now I'm talking from the standpoint of PvE, how does this change PvE? Or how does it affect PvE? For most PvE where Marauders are being used right now, like level 4 missions and null-sec anomalies, I'm pretty sure they can get away with just using the DPS Bastion. Because you're still going to have a tank bonus. Marauders still tank really well. And Marauders are way over tanked for most of that stuff. Now, if you run into a specific mission or an escalation, maybe you need to use the tank bonus or the tank Bastion. And so, again, you need to fit around what you need the ship for.
The problem is, so first of all, incursions. I know that Marauders have seen a massive adoption in incursions. I don't know how much your suggestion would impact that, but it would probably need to be considered at the very least. But I think that the biggest problem is that like the Bastion is clearly modeled after the Dread Siege, right? Like the Marauder is basically the sub-capital dreadnought. It functions as kind of the bridge between the two. So as such, it does get really big tank bonuses, but it also eliminates remote assistance. So I'm concerned that if you reduce its tanking capabilities, you actually like nerf it more significantly than you would expect because it relies on that additional tank since it can't get any external assistance.
But the Marauders, by default, every single one of them has an active tank bonus, and then you're not losing the entirety of your resist bonus and the rep or booster bonus when you're going into DPS mode. Um, now, now again, if you're going into an incursion and you need a lot of tank, then fit the tank bastion or the tank script, whatever the case may be. Again, you're trying to specialize around a particular role. And if you need something to hold aggro or do a lot of, tank a lot of things, then you need to use that tank bastion. And if everything is attacking this one Marauder that...
Uh-oh. Hello? But I want to make sure to give you your time, so let's go ahead and do that. Where were we? We were just talking about Marauders.
Right.
So can you try to convince me what the problem is? Like, I don't understand why Marauders are an issue in nullsec that would require such dramatic, or sorry, not nullsec, but PvP that would require such dramatic influence. What's wrong with a 2 billion plus ship being a mini dread?
So with PvP, I like there to be inherent penalties or weaknesses and counters with every ship. Marauders right now are essentially the old capitals before they were nerfed. So in 2016, we had the new capitals. They applied to everything. They had a ton of DPS. They could Sino in and just delete subcaps essentially. Over time, they got nerfed, and I thought capitals were in a really good spot before CCP nuked their prices. So now, then they did that, and then they buffed Marauders, and now Marauders are doing the exact same thing as Capitals were in the past, except without the Sinos. But now they can go into ESSs and things like that, where generally you're looking at really small gang situations or even solo content, and a solo Marauder is going to counter every single solo ship in the game, unless that Marauder is just really, really badly fit. Like a T2 Marauder, like a pure T2, like T2 booster, is going to counter even like pimp fit T1 battleships or Navy or faction, whatever the case may be.
Well, yeah, it also costs 4 times the cost, right?
Well, not a T2 fit. Like a T2 Marauder is probably like 1.2 bill. And, this was happening when pirate battleships were 2 bill.
Okay.
And then if you wanted to pimp out a pirate battleship, they were like 3 bill or 4 bill, even more. And they still couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the Marauder. And it's not that I don't want Marauders to have some kind of benefit, because I think they should. It's just I want there to be a higher skill ceiling to utilize all the benefits of a Marauder, not just land on top of someone, press one button, and then do 4,000 DPS and tank 5 to 20,000 DPS. It's not engaging gameplay. And then so if we raise the skill ceiling a little bit by making fitting choices, and I think that's the biggest thing I like to push in all my changes is fitting choices. So if you want the best out of it in this particular scenario, fit it in this way. If not, change it. And then that's how you can passively add in specialization to like T2 ships. So that's kind of where I'm going with those changes, is that if you want max DPS, you fit for it. If you want max tank, you fit for it. Or if you want to switch between the two, then there's some other penalty, whether it's a longer bastion or you lose, another utility high.
Right. One of the things I was just thinking about as a crazy idea is, what if, like, in the same way that reactive armor hardeners like adjust to your damage, incoming damage, it'd be kind of interesting if the bastion actually like reduced its damage bonus for the amount of incoming damage that comes in. Like it's shunting energy towards its defenses rather than its offenses.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So basically, the more DPS you do to it, the lower its damage output becomes.
Yeah.
But how would that? I mean, I guess I'd have to actually see how it would scale. But I don't. But see, then what happens when you're in like a max tilt escalation or mission where you got a bunch of incoming damage? Now it's taking you forever to kill rats.
That's a good question. I mean, yeah,
that would piss off a lot of PvE people. So I want to try and avoid that, which is why like a DPS, which is why I'm trying to design it where the DPS bastion is still good for ratting in terms of like the raw tank potential, but you're not losing that DPS for clear speed. But then maybe for high-end PvE like wormholes, you need to make some sacrifices or adjust, how you're fitting out. Because one issue I have with Marauders, especially in wormholes, is that they've made wormholes very safe to do the high-end PvE, because you're no longer needing to field a dread, which is stuck in place for 5 minutes. You're fielding like one Marauder, and as soon as they see a new wormhole pop up or they see something on scan, they can debastion, and within 15, maybe 30 seconds at the most, they can MJD immediately and get out of there. So it's very hard to catch them, and then when you do catch them, sometimes it's not really even worth it compared to the old PvE. And I know that goes against, I want Marauders to be the top tier PvE, but again, there needs to be balance. And sometimes certain things doing PvE escalates to PvP, and you need to have those escalation chains in place and actually have a set piece that people want to fight over. A lot of people don't want to fight over Marauders anymore because they're just not that fun to fight.
I mean, so when CCP rebalanced them and they quote unquote nerfed them, they nerfed them by adding an Achilles heel, right? The fact that they can now be jammed pretty easily comparatively. Do you think that is insufficient? And why?
Yeah, because I mean, if we're going into the typical scenarios that you see Marauders in, right now it's like ESS and small gang, things like that. You're basically telling every solo person or every small gang person, you need to bring some kind of anti-Marauder ship. And while that's fine and good, and we do that, again, we primarily PvP and Tuskers, that meta gets extremely boring very quickly. Like right now, the best counter to a Marauder is just Nightmare spam, because you can sig tank them, you can nude them out, and you're doing 1,000 DPS roughly per
Why
Nightmare.
not just a Griffin Navy issue?
Because a Griffin Navy issue is just going to get nuded off and die. Because every PvP Marauder is going to have a newt, and a Griffin Navy issue is only going to work up close.
Yep.
And then if you go with a standard Griffin or anything at range, Marauders all have range bonuses. Mm-hmm. So they can just blap one out of the sky with their, 2,000, 1,500 DPS, especially if it's like a no tank ECM ship. And that doesn't affect, their tanking or anything like that.
It is true. So like they gave him an Achilles heel, but the people that deploy that Achilles heel uses range as a defense, and the Marauder has a range bonus. So the Marauder is designed to kill the things that are designed to counter it.
Right, and it's not even just one range bonus, because you have the inherent range bonus on the whole, but then you have the added range bonus with Bastion active. So you're kind of stacking range bonuses as well.
Right. Which honestly, the range bonus part of it is probably the part that PvE could adjust most to. Maybe its ability to apply at range is one of the reasons why it's too strong.
Right. It's a lot of things, and I feel like Marauders are running in that same situation that Hacks are and Old Capitals are. It's just they do good at everything, and there's barely any penalty for that. We finally got the EWAR immunity removed, and EWAR immunity was causing all the issues, but it's still a 50% immunity. And now we're running into issues where Marauders are being used in fleets, specifically right now Paladins. Right. So now we have supposedly a PvE ship going into massive fleet fights, and now these fleet ships are approaching 1 million EHP. They're doing anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 DPS.
Are those using Bastion?
Yeah, they're using Bastion. The way it's working in fleets is that they Bastion up. If someone is getting shot, again, they have 1 million EHP, so it does take a while to grind through them. Bastion's only 30 seconds long, so they decycle Bastion if they're getting shot, and then all the Logi reps it back up to max, and then they re-Bastion again.
Isn't the problem really, though, the fact that capitals have been suppressed recently? The major predator of that would be, like, if they lock down their fleet into Bastion, and then you drop dreads, they're going to have a very bad time, right?
Right. That is a part of it. Yeah, and that's
so with capitals being cheaper, wouldn't it be worthwhile to wait to see whether or not that counter comes to fruition?
We can. So that's definitely something that I would like to see happen. I don't know. Obviously, there's going to be a delay until we see capital start coming out. So that might affect the fleet issues, but it doesn't necessarily affect the other PvP scenarios in the game.
Right. I think that given the cost of Marauders, I feel like there's and I will admit my own bias to this. There are kills on the kill board with my Chronos, but I guess like there is something to be said about being the mini boss roaming around that people have to have a fleet to deal with. And you know, it's awesome the things that you can get away with, and it's terrible when you stop being able to get away with it and it explodes. Like, isn't that a
But
sign
sometimes
of
you
something
don't.
that we want?
There should be set pieces and things that create fights, but when every fight is a set piece, and or every fight turns into a non-fight, because if I'm roaming in, uh, let's say a battle cruiser, and someone undocks Marauder, then it's time to leave. There's nothing I can do about that. And that's a very common scenario that happens, is that a Marauder gets undocked for everything that ends up in their space. So now that is a non-content or a content denying scenario.
Doesn't that feel
And
that feels like a good juicy situation for a trap though?
it also means that solo players or more casual players can't find content to engage in because they just get hard countered by a Marauder.
But
So
it
if we're
also
talking
gives an
about,
opportunity for solo players to be that Marauder.
then they just fight three Marauders. That's kind of how these things work out in nullsec, is that there. So going back to the cost thing you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
the ship costs a lot, therefore it should be strong. That is true to an extent, and I do think cost can be a balancing factor. But when everyone is rich, then cost is no. Everyone is rich, or everyone has enough money to afford the OP ship. Then everyone is flying the OP ship, and cost eventually goes out the window, because then it becomes, if you're not flying this ship, then you're at an inherent disadvantage, and why even bother flying any other ship? And that's kind of the same scenario we saw happen with capitals when carriers were like 800 mil, dreads were what was it, 1.5 bill or so. They were just getting dropped on literally everything because they could just decimate everything in their path. Again, Marauders aren't sinoing in, but if you're engaging in the ESS meta and you're sitting in the ESS and a T1 battleship or whatever the case may be, that Marauder is going to warp right into you, and you're stuck. You're not going to be able to get out, and then they're going to hard counter you.
Right. Um, what? So I feel like that's the kind of argument that if you're reductionistic enough can always be made, right? There's always going to be something that's that, right? Like people still claim Munins online. So like, is that really a problem to be solved, right? Like there's always going to be an apex predator. What is the issue with it being Marauders being the apex predator as opposed to something else? And I know that we've gotten a lot into Marauders, so we might want to switch to the next topic after this, but I'm curious.
So Munins affect one aspect of space, which is primarily fleet fights. They're affecting primarily one playstyle, which is null-sec saw warfare. Like, you don't see Munin fleets being the common solution to low-sec issues. I'm sure they happen, but they're not the standard. Munins in isolation, one, two, three, four, five of them, isn't a big deal in solo or small game. You can handle that. The Munins are primarily an issue in large fleet fights because of all the benefits they provide, and they snuff out a lot of counter doctrines just because of how good they are.
Right.
Marauders.
My point is not that that Munins are everywhere. My point is that it is easy when you look at things from a reductionist point of view to simply say that it is Munins online. So my question is this Marauder thing really that big of an issue that's being that oppressive, or are we just focusing on where they happen to be really good?
Outside of, so I would say that Marauders are an issue in nullsec, because they're everywhere now. They're in fleets, ESS, small gang, home defense. Every scenario you can think of in nullsec, they're being used. They're being used in anomalies. They're being used in escalations, which I'm fine with. They're doing the PVE thing, great. But when all of your content boils down to Marauders, then people experience a stale meta. We're tired of flying the same thing to counter them, and again, like I was mentioning about Munins, they're specifically to a certain playstyle, which is nullsec fleet fights. Marauders are every playstyle, whether it's solo, small gang, fleet, PvE, home defense, etc., etc. There's a marauder involved, so that spread across multiple playstyles and then being good at every single one of them, I think, is the issue here that I'm trying to address.
Right. All right. That's a good answer. I do want to shift gears because we're running low on time. We did have that interruption, so I'll go a little bit longer. But it was brought up earlier, a question more about the CSM on a meta level, which is that, every year we get multiple people on the CSM from the same block, right? Like, for example, this year we had, Pro God Legend and Vili. It could be argued that those two positions were effectively just two seats doing one seat's job, right? Do you have frustration with this as a person who is constantly like the independent that gets locked out? Do you feel like CCP should do something about that? What, if anything, could CCP do?
That's, I mean, it's something I've thought about a lot, but let's see, how would I word this? It's hard to develop a system that can't be gamed by large groups. And even if we had specific slots for specific gameplay, what's to stop a big group from just saying, "Hey, this is our like solo guy in the group,"
Yeah, it's
and
Goonswarm's wormhole candidate. It's Goonswarm's high-sec candidate. It's
right,
Goonswarm's industry candidate.
right, and that's like every scenario you come up with where you try and offer some, uh, arbitrary restriction to try to get the CSM more fleshed out is always going to be gamed the same way. The only way it can't be gamed is if you have like representatives in CCP that know the players and know the game and say, yeah, this person is definitely not part of Goonswarm, but I have doubts that that's ever going to happen. You could have like an outside, group that says, oh, yeah, and do the same thing. That's not part of the CCP, but then you're going to get, claims of corruption or bias or whatever the case may be. So you're going to kind of run into the same mess you run into now. And again, who's to say that large groups aren't going to get people in those groups to provide bias to their group?
Right.
So it's kind of a mess.
Do you think the
So
CSM has been effective for the last 3 years?
what was that? Did you say
Do
the
you think that the
CSM has been
CSM has
effective?
been effective over the last 3 years? I choose 3 years because that's when you've been running. So I assume that that's when you've been paying the most attention to the CSM.
To varying degrees, I think they've been effective, and I don't think it's anything that the CSM personally has done. It's just depending on CCP is listening to that feedback or not.
Do you feel like you've been effective at getting things done?
I think that I have been, so considering I'm not on the CSM and I've gotten multiple changes put in the game, I'd say I'm fairly effective at getting those things put in because I'm focusing on changes that are something historically I've seen CCP do in terms of how they balance the game and how far they can go technically.
Right.
And then I am providing feedback that is not emotionally charged and is just facts and not facts. Things that we see in other areas of the game on how it's been balanced, and seeing how other areas of the game are not balanced in that same way that are causing issues. So I think that is input that CCP can react on. Now, maybe they may not do it right away, which is fine because CCP is on a theme schedule where they're saying, we're going to do a patch and it's going to be based around this theme. And if maybe one of my ideas is part of that theme, then gets implemented, like the torpedo changes, the blobs changes, things like that. So I would say that yes, I have been effective in the specific areas that I have recommended changes being put in. They've been added to the game. Again, it may not have happened immediately, but it did happen at some point down the line.
So if you've been effective and the CSM has been questionably effective, why do you feel the need to be on the CSM? You're already effective.
Especially this year with faction warfare coming out, or with faction warfare changes being announced, I want to kind of be there while it's happening so I can provide that direct input and feedback as those changes are being discussed. It's one thing to be able to say, hey, change these things after the fact when they say, hey, here's the faction warfare patch is coming out in 2 weeks, and saying, oh well, this is going to ruin everything. And only having like a 1 week or 2 week window to provide feedback, compared to actually being there during the discussion and saying, well, maybe you shouldn't do it this way, you can do it this other way, or that'll be abused by larger groups, whatever the case may be. I can at least provide that input directly, instead of waiting for the announcement and then trying to rush it all in within a small period of time.
Right. Okay. So on your thing, it says that you are going to, what does it say? Tackle alts? Where did I find it? I saw something there.
Scroll down just a little bit more.
There it is. Wanting to challenge Eve's alt-focused nature, specifically in regards to gimmick balances that ease alt usage further. So I am I'm definitely on the camp of alts are, if not the problem, the symptom of the problem. The desire for people to, and the drive for people to solve their solution through alts rather than friends. So that line in particular interests me. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So from my perspective, I think alts are legitimate in some cases. So I just want to get that out of the way now. Like, I don't think anyone wants to be someone else's Sino to move a ship around. I can understand alt to some extent with like certain tasks like mining or PI production, market trading, things like that. I start to run into issues when alts are the best solution to especially PvP engagements. Like I mentioned before, like the Ramjag. The Ramjag is a very easy ship to use as an alt, because you can click approach, hit ADCU, tackle something, and you don't really even need to worry about it. Maybe cycle the booster every once in a while to tank. Compared to like an interceptor alt. An interceptor alt requires a lot more micro to be effective. Sure, you can AFK with it and stuff like that, and it can do okay, but it can still be countered pretty easily if you know what you're doing. And the problem with the alt situation with the Ramjag is, like we talked about earlier, is the ADCU. It is a single button press that does everything you need, and you never have to look at it again, because you get the bonuses for that full 15 seconds. So that's kind of one of the issues I have with those kind of situations. Is there's one button press, you can go to your other account and pretty much ignore it and get all the bonuses. You don't need to manage it. Same thing with like, to a lesser extent, probably not used a whole lot by alts, but the same thing as like the Battleship Signature module, where you just press it one time, it goes through the whole duration. Bastion is similar. You press one button, you get all the bonuses. Like, I want more micro involved, so that if you're using a bunch of alts, and a bunch, I would say, like, you're managing three to 10 at the same time, there's more micro involved in the modules than just pressing one module and you can ignore it and move on to other things.
But so how do we fix? What do we do?
So, like I mentioned with the ADCU, a constant cap draw during every few seconds. So that way you're needing to manage cap at the same time. You can't just press a button and ignore it, otherwise you'll cap yourself out. Or it provides counter with
that fixes that one particular issue. Is that really
right.
it when it comes to the problem?
So then you have, now in terms of that one problem, are you meaning alts in general or just the one button press?
Well, I guess both, but mostly the idea of alts being too simple to play, or to be utilized in PvP, right? Is the ADCU really the one thing that makes that true, or is this a more complicated problem?
It's more complicated. Those are just kind of the simple things I can go off of. Like, links are kind of similar too.
And by the way, the assault damage control default is 10 seconds, not 15 for Tech 2.
Oh, okay.
They nerfed it a while back.
I think it got
I remember it was 15 originally.
Right. So Links are similar, but the one thing with links is you do need to be kind of within range of your group to provide links. But kind of like I mentioned earlier, link alts to an extent are understandable because no one wants to fly a ship that all it does is provide links.
If you think that my
Command ships
command
that,
ship only provides links,
well, Bifrosts typically only
yeah,
provide
I
links.
mean,
And we have like backpack Bifrosts, which to an extent that can be okay depending on the ship that they're supporting. But moving on from that, that's the general theory, is that one button press modules synergize really well with alts because they don't require management, they don't require micro, they just can scale pretty much infinitely to some degree. Now, if we really wanted to tackle alts and make it really hard to use them, there is a way to do that. I doubt it'll ever happen, which is removing all the auto navigation commands like approach, orbit, keep at range, and all flight has to happen manually and clicking
right.
in space, which everyone would hate.
I think, but I think that that does bring me to the question that I was going to ask, which is that like one of the issues is that first of all the problem solution sets that we're coming up with is relatively basic, but I feel like it's going to have some pretty nasty ramifications, right? Because the more we make things difficult for alts to do, the more we are making it difficult for new players to do. If a task is simple enough for a new player to be able to take it on, then it's probably simple enough for an experienced player to do with an alt better, given the better access to equipment that that an experienced player has.
So I'm trying to understand the wording that you're using. So we're using new
How do we make it?
players.
How do we make things more challenging for alts that doesn't? There's always this problem where when CCP tries to fix something for like big scale blocks, it always hurts the little people more because the big blocks always have the ability to adapt better than smaller groups do, right? So that on an individual level, the more complicated that you make a task, a secondary task to be done, you're not actually encouraging people to swap over to do having another person doing it. You're just making it harder for even that extra person to do it. You know what I mean? Like if you get rid of approach, that doesn't just hurt the ability for alts to be able to do what they're supposed to do, but it also really hurts the ability for new players to just be able to like hold on for dear life.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I'm not saying that that should actually happen. I'm just saying that that is, if you wanted to actually address alts without like putting in hard limits, then that's probably the best way to do it. But I don't think it'll ever happen,
Right.
and I think it's too heavy-handed to actually be implemented. There's too many other issues there. Now, maybe on the one hand, it's nice that new players would learn how to click approach in space or control ranges on their own, because I think that makes you a better pilot in the long term. But again, like you said, we don't want the game to become tedious. So I'm again, I'm fully on board with that. I don't think we should remove those. I just more using it as an example on if you really wanted to address alt usage in PvP, you could remove those auto navigation commands.
Right. Yeah, I understand. So, but with the push button receive bacon, couldn't you argue that like all F1 monkey style setups are effectively that? Like if I can hit one button to be a ramjag pilot, I can have that many megathrons in a Baltic fleet, for example.
Right, and there is some overlap there with fleet fights just because of how they're designed. But generally, you're not having a bunch of alts in fleet. Now, I'm sure it happens. I'm sure there's someone out there that's running 10 megas in the 2,000 man fleet fight. But on average, I don't think that's happening a whole bunch. But it's happening more in home defense situations, or like the guy with 20 miners just reships his 20 miners to 20 combat ships, and he can have three of them as ramjags and barely even pay attention to them and still be effective, because again they don't require any micro. Same thing with Munin. Now it could be happening in Munins because again they're very simple to use. You can press ADCU when you get targeted, and kind of mitigate that without a whole lot of micro. Because again, you're cap stable with a Munin, so you're not even having to really worry about your micro warp drive.
Right. All right. Well, either way, you've got 10 minutes to talk about anything if I have missed anything, or you want to double down on anything.
Uh, so we talked a lot about balance. Again, I am with faction warfare coming back up or coming back into rebalance. I am definitely wanting to focus on that a lot more because nullsec has become the PvP punching bag for a long time. And I've said this before. If there was more outlets to where people could PvP without only going to nullsec, that opens up more potential easing of restrictions in nullsec. It means that nullsec can focus on their own thing as empire building and whatever the case may be, and that kind of decouples the whole this is the only place to PvP aspect of the game and shifts it back more to low sec and faction warfare, which I think is good for the game.
I think
A
that
lot
there
of
has been
people,
plenty of conflict in faction warfare and Pochfin.
well, plenty of conflict in faction warfare now. There was, but what faction warfare is now is a shell of what it was
That's
before
true.
Citadels.
Yes, I'm not going to say that it's great, but what I'm saying is that like this notion that you don't get fights in low sec is also pretty false.
Well, I didn't say there was no fights happening in low sec.
Fair
It's
enough.
just in terms of
But Pochfin is
your time roaming in low sec, you're really not going to find a whole lot in faction warfare minus frigate fights, which is fine. But again, people want to fight other things outside of frigates, and like I live in a wormhole and I go through the chain and I roam low sec, faction warfare, and non-faction warfare all the time, and it's difficult to find interactions in faction warfare outside of just roaming around in frigates.
Well, what about Pochfin? It's pretty consistently one of the most deadliest nullsec region, and it's pretty small comparatively.
Right, but then that's also being taken over by the large groups. Well, maybe not taken over, but it's being there's a lot of interactions with large groups coming in, and that's fine for large fleet fights. But for like the general purpose or casual player, especially with how Pochvin's designed, because you need to have standings and things like that, which newer players or more casual players may not have yet.
Well, you only need standings for the home systems now.
Right. Well, you need standings not to get shot by the rats and things like that
Fair
as well.
enough.
Correct.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So
Embrace
that's not a huge obstacle to overcome. But in terms of saying, hey, newer player or person interested in PvP, go to Pochvin, but you need to do all these other prerequisites first instead of just like going out into faction warfare or low sec, which is connected directly to those high secs that maybe they're running missions in, and they're like, hey, I've done enough missions, I want to try out PvP with a cheap ship. And roaming in Pochvin with a Tristan or a Rifter or whatever, yeah, you might be able to find a fight, but is it going to be a fight that a new player is going to learn something from? Is kind of more my point.
Right. All right, but so you were saying that nullsec is currently the main focus of PvP, and you'd like to see that distributed around. There is a question, like what is the problem with nullsec being the main place to go for PvP? Doesn't that seem like intuitively the correct answer?
Because we're trying to jam so many things into nullsec to make it the PvP zone, it's losing sight, and I think it's overly punishing the people living in nullsec to some degree. I'm not going to sit here and defend that nullsec can go AFK and just farm money all day. That's not what I mean. It's that I think there is some levers or adjustments that have been added in nullsec just for the sake of trying to get PvP people to PvP, but it's not really having the effect that we want. And instead of continually pushing nullsec to, hey, you're the PvP zone, you need to engage every single person that roams in your space, and you need to have fair fights or things like that. Instead of doing that, just kind of decouple that, shift some of that focus into faction warfare, and then nullsec can focus more on being the empire building, or this is my space, this is how I'm going to build my space, this is how to defend my space kind of scenario. And then you can kind of shift some of that income or penalties that we're currently experiencing or seeing in nullsec back into the people that live there, and then it can be balanced specifically for that instead of, again, constantly trying to balance small gang and nullsec empire building. You can have them say, well, small gang can go live in faction warfare or get more consistent PvP in there compared to roaming nullsec and always butting heads with how people defend their space.
Right. Well, I will say that the good news is that it seems like CCP is going in that direction, which, as you said, is a really good reason why you would be useful on the CSM right now. I started this whole thing kind of comparing you a little bit, maybe even unfairly, to Torvald, but I think that the answer that we settle on is the fact that, I mean, again, not to necessarily go too much into another person's talk, but you know, he would freely admit that he's not necessarily the fitting balance dude, right? And so, like, you know, while he's more about the emotional impact of things, you're talking more about the technical aspect of things, and I think that that's, you know, extremely important. I don't think that anybody would argue otherwise. So, I think that one of the issues that CCP has is like the pendulum swings really, really hard, right? So as we are now entering into the quote unquote, you know, living universe phase of things, it's going to be important to not lose sight of those technical, mechanical balance issues and really be able to tease out the nuance of it, which you've been able to communicate very, very well and kind of drill on past the upper level of the issues and into more specifics. And especially, like, I know people may disagree, but with people like CCP Rise and CCP now Kestrel coming on and such like that, CCP has actually like really looked at balance more and more recently than they have historically. Like long ago, long are the days of, you know, 2 years of Svitpol dominance, right? So to that end, I think that you have shown a consistency for your desire and your belief in the CSM. You have shown a consistency in your ability to give well thought out, effective, and actionable feedback. And I think that with everything going on and during a period of upheaval, it is an incredibly easy argument to make that you are the exact kind of person that we need on the CSM this year in order to help make sure that this gets done right. Because this is the kind of thing where every little mistake now, every little choice now will have, you know, butterfly effect level consequences for maybe a decade to come. So it's important to get as much of it right as possible. And having people with the bona fides to say, not only do they have good ideas, but they have a history of having ideas that end up being not only implemented, but being well received when implemented. I don't think we went into this enough, but those things that you recommended are almost universally things that were not only accepted by CCP, but then really, really appreciated by the player base. These were popular things when they finally were implemented. So the proof is in the pudding there, and I think that you have a very strong candidacy.
Thank you.
Anything else?
And let's see. So there was one thing I saw that popped up in chat that I wanted to address real quick. Specifically, balancing instead of new ships is not a selling point. I agree with that. And when I say balancing, I'm also including that I feel like there should be new ships in the game added relatively consistently as long as they're filling a role in the game.
Yeah. I want to jump in there, actually. When you balance things, that's when you get new ships. Because when you balance something, you can either buff it or you can buff its predator, right? Because everything's just a balance.
So right, and new ships provide pressure to things that are dominant in the meta. You can design, and this goes back to like we were talking about the Marauder and hacks or whatever. I'm not going to get into those too much, but if you have a ship that is OP, instead of nerfing the ship, you can also introduce a new ship that counteracts it to some degree, but also has its own penalties. Right. Obviously, we can get into bad scenarios there where, if you have a bunch of rats in the house, you release a bunch of cats, and then you need a bunch of dogs to deal with the cats, et cetera, et cetera. Then you run into those scenarios, which isn't good either. But
well, I mean, as long as the dog can get eaten by rats, we're fine.
Right, exactly. But so that there's a lot of levers you can use with a new ship to do that. They also are blank slates, and there's a lot of people in EVE that enjoy the game more for making fittings and tinkering with things rather than actually playing the game. They'll still play the game because they want to test their fits. Like, I'm one of those people. If I have a blank slate to work with that no one knows how it works, that is a lot of fun to me. So again, in my opinion, balancing existing ships and introducing new ships should be going hand in hand with each other. We should not just be constantly rebalancing the same things And the people who are like, no, don't introduce new ships, rebalance only the existing ships, I think those people are wrong, because without new ships, you're just dealing with the same thing all the time, just repackaged a little bit differently, and people can figure that out very quickly, and now you're just stuck with the same scenario again.
Right. But on the other hand, the idea of like, we need new ships always frustrates me, because it's like, well, what are they going to do? Right. Like, we actually already have ships that don't necessarily see sufficient use. In order to create new ships, we have to have new things for that ship to do. It can't just be more of the same, in my opinion.
For sure.
There is a question though, that was asked, because we were talking about like the different counters and all that stuff. How would you feel about moving ECM to a high slot?
I think I've actually recommended that before, but yeah, I don't have a problem with it as long as the mid slots are rebalanced appropriately to adjust for tank. So the main thing with ECM is they have a bunch of mid slots. In theory, and again, it doesn't work this way really, but in theory, you have a bunch of mid slots, so you can dedicate a few mids for your ECM, and then the rest of the mods to tank. Typically, though, ECM ships are just all mids or ECM, and then you might go armor tank or something like that. So a high slot ECM, I think, makes a lot of sense, especially if it's, potentially scripted. Then that kind of eliminates having to rainbow your mids as it would go.
Right.
But then, you need to have some penalties along with that. So maybe a longer reload between switching scripts or something like that. But again, I don't have any issues with ECM being a high slot, as long as the rest of the ship is rebalanced, so that you're not getting like 120,000 HP Falcons that can jam everything with max jams.
Right. And to conclude, of course, the most important question: what is your feelings on cat ears?
I mean, monetization, if CCP can figure out monetization and make money from that, then I'm perfectly fine with cat ears. If they're done tastefully and it doesn't look obnoxious on a bunch of ships, or if they do it just for avatars, and sure, go for it.
What if being obnoxious is the point?
You know what? Right. If it makes CCP money and people are happy, then go for it.
Well, I appreciate that. And like I said, best of luck. You have a very strong candidacy. Look forward to seeing the rest of your campaign. But that should just about wrap it up for us for this interview. Thank you guys for watching and checking it out. If you're watching this on YouTube and watching the playlist, you can just go ahead and wait, and it'll go on to the next video. But either way, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help the channel. Go ahead and post any questions down below. Likewise, you can go to his Discord or his forum post to ask him anything that you want to. He definitely wants your vote. And yeah, and so this is just one of many interviews, and we are trying to raise the electorate's knowledge and make sure that we have an informed electorate, because an informed electorate makes an effective CSM, and the CSM is a very powerful tool, but only if we let it be so. It's only as good as we make it. So let's make it great together. Thank you so much, Stitch, for coming, and best of luck to you.
Thanks for having me.
And on behalf of Stitch and myself, this has been the Eve Universe Show's CSM 17 coverage. And until next time, I've been Astrothi, the voice of New Eden, and I'll see you in space.